Hello, my name is Merari, and today I'm going to be doing my X-Credit presentation, Unearthing Censorship in Costa Rica. Throughout this class, we have looked at how censorship has played a role in different countries, specifically Barcelona during the Franco dictatorship times. Now, as a law and criminal justice major, this topic fascinates me. I've studied censorship, and so Costa Rica. This past winter break, I had the privilege of attending Costa Rica with Hood College. And so this country is known for its biodiversity, coffee, ecotourism, and immense hospitality. So what if a country such as Costa Rica, known for peace and democracy, started silencing its journalists? Well, in Costa Rica, this is actually happening, or at least a growing number of citizens believe that it is happening. So this is a story of censorship, conflict, and freedom. So first off, I want to go into defining censorship. So what is censorship? So censorship is the suppression of speech, writing, or expression considered threatening to the common good. But who defines what's threatening, and who gets silenced in the process? So I have studied censorship specifically in the United States. This can take many forms, such as banning books that have contrary beliefs to the popular belief, or they could be censored for an unpopular ideal, or simply because the government doesn't like the ideal that it is presenting. In the United States, we've seen examples of censorship. Censorship can take many forms in terms of art, literature, speech. Now, what is freedom of speech? So in Costa Rica, it looks a little different, but I'm going to talk to you about what freedom of speech is and what I've learned in my undergraduate studies as a law and criminal justice major. So freedom of speech is a First Amendment constitutional right. The First Amendment grants freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of expression, and freedom of religion. These are essential civil liberties embedded into our Constitution. Now, Costa Rica actually has something similar. They have this ideal of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, too. While it may not be we don't see it as reinforced necessarily in Latin America, but it is extremely prevalent. It is recognized that freedom of speech and freedom of press is a fundamental right. So now, where does censorship get into this? So in 2025, Costa Rica dropped significantly in the freedom of press rankings. And I'm going to show you a graph detailing just how much they dropped. So according to Reporters Without Borders, this decline is driven by verbal attacks from the president, Rodrigo Chavez, on major news outlets like La Nación and Teletica. And so these two outlets, La Nación and Teletica, are broadcasting networks. They give information. There's news networks, and they're also newspapers. So they give information. Now, the purpose of the First Amendment in the United States, and how I'm going to do this, is make my argument in a comparison to the United States and Costa Rica. Because both freedom of speech and freedom of press has been established as a fundamental civil liberty in both, there's this idea that individuals should be allowed to speak. They should be allowed, and the press should be allowed to report information. Journalism should be able to report back to the public. This is a protected right. It's how they gain information. So what happens in Costa Rica? So Teletica is a broadcast network, and verbal attacks from President Rodrigo Chavez on major news outlets such as La Nación and Teletica are talking about how freedom of press is being censored. So why is it being censored? There's a couple reasons. In the freedom of press, Costa Ricans actually, they fear repercussions. So this is an image of the president of Costa Rica, Rodrigo Chavez. And so it's not just traditional media, right? So censorship takes many forms. We can ban books. We can limit freedom of speech. Now, what does that look like? So in the United States, the Supreme Court has ruled that freedom of speech is protected under the First Amendment. And while they're normally pretty generous in expanding the right to freedom of speech, there are limitations to freedom of speech. The First Amendment right is not absolute. So what does that mean? So as we can see here in Costa Rica, why is there... First of all, this graph is explaining that from 2014 to 2024, this is how the World Bank has ranked freedom of press in Costa Rica. So it's currently at 76.13%, which is pretty high in countries, especially in Latin America. But still concerning. It dropped from 80.2% to 76.13%. So why are we seeing distrust in public? Why are we seeing an increase in restrictions on freedom of press? So like I said before, there's an expectation of freedom of press and freedom of speech in both Costa Rica and the United States. Censorship limits those ideals. So censorship can take various forms, but a study done in Costa Rica for the university students, they asked them how do they feel about their post online, that it is safe and it won't be redacted, meaning taken away by the government. And so 48.46% of individuals in Costa Rica fear expressing opinions online. And because they're often hesitant, so a survey was done, and a national survey in Costa Rica reveals that 53% of Costa Ricans believe censorship exists in their media landscape. This could be social media networks such as Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. But this shows not only a political shift, but a culture one. So today we're unearthing censorship in Costa Rica. And so while in Barcelona we looked at in class, there was examples of limiting art, and in the United States there's freedom of speech that is limited. Censorship looks a little different in Costa Rica. So what is being targeted? Major media networks like La Nación and La Telítica, they faced direct retaliation. Costa Rica's own Supreme Court actually ruled the government shutdown of a venue that was linked to La Nación that violated the Constitution. So what does this mean? That the Supreme Court of Costa Rica has established we have this inherent freedom of speech, we have an inherent freedom of right. Censorship exists primarily to protect the public, or at least that's one argument made in favor of censorship. Censorship is there because in the United States, freedom of speech, like I've said, it's not absolute, but it's been protected as a First Amendment right. Freedom of speech is protected. Certain things of speech are not protected, like hate speech. Now, critics will argue, and opponents of censorship will argue that it's a violation of the First Amendment right. And ultimately, it can be if it is constantly done to fit a political agenda that goes against a mainstream ideology. Now, here's the thing with censorship. Censorship is in place to protect individuals from hate speech. But in Costa Rica, and we look at the United States, we look at Barcelona, why were these news outlets censored? And it's because it didn't want to convey an ideology that contradicts certain political ideologies. Now, the Supreme Court in Costa Rica ruling that this was a violation of the Constitution, a violation of the First Amendment, that the government shutting down a venue on La Nación, a telenetwork that is broadcasted throughout Costa Rica, but in Latin America, I said this was unconstitutional. So what is Costa Rica doing? So we're unearthing Costa Rica, we're unearthing censorship, this idea that, as we saw in class, as we've seen in the United States, there have been books that are being censored, art that is being censored, social media posts that are being censored, but in Costa Rica, in Latin America, it is so much more prevalent. Freedom of press is being censored. So journalists are in a very terrifying position right now in Latin America, because they're fearing to report that their work may be censored or that they're going to face verbal attacks or threats. But there is still hope. So although Costa Rica's freedom of press ranking has gone down in the World Bank, it's extremely high compared to many Latin American countries. And also their legal framework, Costa Rica's legal framework and cultural respect for freedom of speech remains resilient. We can see this in Supreme Court decisions in Costa Rica that are protecting freedom of press and freedom of speech, which just reinforces this idea that censorship may exist, but ultimately, individuals were seeing, ultimately, freedom of speech is going to prevail, or at least that's the hope. So now I'm going to talk to you about what is the hope in the legal system? What is the hope that Costa Rica is doing to combat the censorship of social media posts. Why do so many citizens, 53% of citizens in Costa Rica, feel that they can't post on their social media without feeling unsafe? So Costa Rica, first of all, individuals are peacefully protesting their civic engagements. And also individuals, you can see individuals protesting, they're waving the Costa Rican flag with hopeful action. So what do we need to do? So like I said, censorship is a very important ideal. And a lot of people will argue that censorship is a bad thing. And it can be. It can be a violation of First Amendment rights. But it's important to note that the First Amendment is not absolute. So long as censorship is made to protect individuals and not harm individuals or infringe upon their constitutional right of freedom of speech or freedom of press, censorship should be allowed. Now, that being said, right now, in Costa Rica, we're seeing censorship in a way that we didn't see in Barcelona, that we didn't see in the United States, but we have before. So, when news outlets and journalism are not able to perform their duties of informing the public about what's going on in politics, in the country, economically, whatever it may be, we face strong implications on infringing upon other civil liberties. So this is extremely important. So censorship doesn't always begin with silence, but sometimes it starts with doubt, fear, and dismissal. And in Costa Rica, we are seeing the fight for freedom of expression isn't over. It's only just begun. So ultimately, different countries have different rules on censorship. Now, as we can see in Costa Rica, in conclusion, so censorship is a changing of the suppression or prohibition of speech or writing that is deemed subversive to the common good. The problem with that is the common good is subjective. What may be deemed common good to the government may not be the common good to the people. So we've seen a decline in press freedom and attack on journalism in Costa Rica. Like I said, according to the ranking of freedom of speech, the main culprit is a series of verbal attacks by government officials in Costa Rica against journalists and media outlets like La Nación and Política. So, but Costa Rica is combating this. There is hope. That's the good news, is that Costa Rica's legal framework and cultural respect for free speech are still strong. We're seeing Supreme Court decisions that are reinforcing this idea that freedom of speech is a protected right. And as we've seen, the media, how the general public feels. Now, surveys are a good way to determine how the public opinion, how public opinion feels on certain aspects. So the survey polled 1,000 Costa Rican citizens with all over 18 with cell phone access, and they gave a perspective that that they don't feel safe posting on social media now, a network, because they're afraid it'll be censored. 53% of these respondents believe there's a degree of censorship or restrictions on freedom of expression in the country. Now, this needs to be changed because freedom of speech, freedom of expression is a fundamental right. So nearly half of Costa Ricans feel that they're unable to post online what they want to say, or they'll face potential repercussions. And this is extremely concerning. It highlights that individuals in Costa Rica don't feel safe to express their speech. And so when these news networks such as La Nación and Política, big, large networks in Latin America and specifically in Costa Rica, it calls into question some fear. But nonetheless, the Constitutional Chamber, which is the Supreme Court of Costa Rica, ruled that this was a violation of the press. So the legal system is working to ensure that individuals' civil liberties are not infringed upon. But when looking at censorship from a legal standpoint, from what I have learned in my undergraduate studies, is that censorship isn't always bad. But ultimately, it's important that governments do not infringe upon constitutional rights by censoring ideals in the media that simply may go against their own political agenda. Today, I unearthed Costa Rica, censorship in Costa Rica. Now, the implications for censorship, if we continue to let this happen, can be extremely vast. This can lead to other civil liberties infringing upon. I used a comparative standpoint of the United States because that is what I specifically studied, and also talked to you about what censorship is and how the United States protects censorship, but they also protect freedom of speech above all else. However, it's not an absolute right. But in Costa Rica, we're not seeing individuals abusing that right, but they're simply trying to act on their right. They're simply trying to use the right that is given to them. Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't hope. As we've seen, Costa Rica has acknowledged that this is a problem and they're willing to call to action. This was my X-credit project on unearthing Costa Rica. Throughout this class, we talked about censorship. But through this class, I learned that unearthing doesn't necessarily mean unearthing archaeological sites. It can, but it's about unearthing something in the literal sense and physical sense. Censorship is an incredibly important ideal to look at and unearth from different countries. If I had more time, I really think it'd be very interesting to compare different countries such as Costa Rica, the United States, and Barcelona, Spain, cities. It could be cities in Costa Rica, cities in the United States, and cities such as Barcelona in Spain that deal with censorship and ultimately try and find a comparison. But at the end of the day, between Costa Rica and the United States, there's an agreed upon initiative that censorship should never violate individuals' fundamental rights. Thank you.